When I was in the finance industry and my career was very much exposed to that change from in post 9/11 period. And then, of course, the financial crash. And it was just not acceptable to not know where the money that you managed was either coming from or going to.
Mm.
You simply couldn't say, I don't know, because you knew ultimately that the financial intelligence unit or the local regulator would not accept a don't know. You had to have the systems in place. And this is where the due diligence legislation falls away, because it doesn't really address proper systemic change inside businesses. What infrastructure should you use? What should you apply? That's where you're going to have to do the thinking yourself. But in a corporation, you've got lots of resources. You've got the ability to seek consultants, and that's something you should want to do.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Hidden Traffic. My name is Gwen Hassan, and I'm really excited today to have Duncan Jepson with me. He is the Managing Director of Liberty Shared. Welcome, Duncan.
Thanks, Gwen. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to come and speak with you.
I'm thrilled to know more about you and your organization. So I'll share a little bit of background with the listeners, which is I was lucky enough to be invited to be part of a panel on forced labor. And Duncan was one of the keynote speakers for the panel. And I was just enthralled with what he had to say. So immediately, as soon as the program was over, I reached out and poached him as a guest on the podcast. Duncan, could you start out by telling us a little bit about your background? I mean, I know you started out actually as a documentary filmmaker. Is that right? How did you go from there to human trafficking and forced labor? That misalignment became very in stark contrast, right? Between the lines of people and the excited executive. Yeah.
Exactly. And I experienced it once before in China. I'd gone to a manufacturing company I had a client who was looking to buy baseball caps. This was in about 94. And I went to a factory in China, and there were a lot of very young people in this factory, and it did not look good. And I came out with my sort of business manager, and I said, we've got to do something about that. And I cannot say that I was full throttle. Wasn't some sort of hard charging response like I might have now. But the guy said to me, well, who are you going to tell? Who is it that you're going to phone and email, or well, not email, because I didn't have email back then. Who are you going to phone that will do something? And, we ran through a very short list. And I said, yeah, you're right. There's nobody. And that stuck with me as well, because it was a feeling of, I wouldn't say helplessness, because I wasn't necessarily completely compelled at that time to go as far as I have done with Liberty Shared. But I would say that there was a feeling of
ineffectual or not.
Yeah, ineffectiveness, but I think disappointment is the word. That's as good as it gets. It actually, for all of the ideological positions, the truth is, in practice, if you actually wanted to do something, there's very little you can do. And I don't think things have changed radically now, but there have been changes, which we'll discuss.
Yeah, so that's a great segue into Liberty Shared. Tell us about it. I have to tell you, before I heard you speak as part of the UIC program, I had not heard of Liberty Shared. So I'm glad to be able to give you some more exposure for your organization, because I bet there are other people like me out there who weren't aware. If I'm understanding correctly from looking at your website and talking to you, the main focus here is on kind of data gathering, right? And research and intelligence sharing. Is that an accurate way to describe what Liberty Shared's focus is?
That's very good, actually, Gwen. Thank you. And I would say that the shared aspect of it is really important. It is gathering information about what happens on the ground, then communicating that to individuals or groups or organizations that can do something in response. And that has two sides to it, therefore. One is, how do you gather information and what information are you gathering? And although we talk about data, because it's sort of the most obvious word to discuss, the truth is we're not interested in statistics. We're not interested in estimations. We're interested in data as it is accurate and can produce actionable information and evidence. Why do we want that? Because we want action. And we then had to identify, okay, who then you're going to give the information to? Is it going to be policymakers? Is it going to be law enforcement? Is it going to be, is it going to be businesses or other civil society? And in truth, it's going to be all of those, but it isn't going to necessarily be every single individual organization in each of those groups. You're going to suddenly find that, which is what I found, I would say about 6 years ago, is that you suddenly realize that the assumptions are something that I made, and maybe I was naive, that the system kind of works, but let's say we can describe it as many people do, but it works, but it's broken at the moment, is a fallacy. The system is extremely incomplete, and there's no better place, I think, to look at how incomplete the system is. And I mean in the true idea of a system of there being forward motion and feedback.
Kind of a virtuous cycle of some sort.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then looking at accountability and so the market, capitalism, the global economy, which is very much structured around a kind of one-way approach of how do we make profits? How do we maximize shareholder value, investor value? The idea that in doing that, we might cause harm elsewhere, and that at times that harm might be actually so unacceptable that it might warrant some sort of punitive response, even when that punitive response is somehow fixed into the jurisdiction or in some way into a regulator and becomes actually manifested. The actual ability of that, or the chance rather, of that accountability taking place is very, very limited. And I think if you've, ever worked in corporate law, in a corporation, and you've worked in compliance or risk management, ultimately, most of us know that it's far easier to get away with things than it is to be concerned necessarily about the risk of being caught up by something. And that's actually quite sad, because what it means is there ultimately is a whole area of society which is sort of missing, which is the fact that people aren't going to be held accountable for the actions they take that cause harm to maybe other people, but maybe it's the environment, or maybe it's some other area of habitat. That's what I learned in the last 7 or 8 years of really being active, really building Liberty Shared, and the few years prior to that when I started it. That became very, both, I think, disappointing and upsetting, but also sad that truthfully is that no matter when I'm teaching, for instance, at Princeton or at Georgetown, looking at students, trying to say, yes, people will be held accountable. The truth is, I know that they probably won't.
Well, and that's part of, I think, what fascinated me too about your model, which is one of the examples you gave when we were talking was about making referrals to Interpol or filing petitions with US CBP with actionable information. So is it accurate to say that you're kind of looking to fill the accountability gap that exists?
I mean, I don't think it's not fill it, but I think to be honest, it's at least be involved in it and participate in, first of all, identifying where those gaps are. Because part of the problem is that you can sit at your desk and you can muse about where the gaps are. You can produce a classic gap assessment, and you can say, okay, there's risk here, there's no risk there, or that there should be risk here, but there's no law or no regulation or no enforcement actually in response to that. So nothing's going to happen. What I wanted to know, first of all, is in practice, just how far does this really go? If you have information and you want to use it, or you want other people to use it, who is there out there that can respond? It was very disappointing to find out that there were really very few, say, organizations or institutions that would actually use information effectively. And so Liberty Shared, it's a small organization. Its main purpose was, to some degree, you might look at it and say, well, it was a bit of an experiment. But the idea was have information and use that information to, at the very least, establish where the failings are, the weaknesses are, where just simply the gaps are. And in that, perhaps you will stumble across the right people doing things that you think, okay, this actually could make a real difference. It's going to be an emergent difference. And I'm a big fan of complex adaptive systems. The idea that you can focus on sort of bilaterals and collaborative efforts. These are more political kind of, arrangements of negotiation, and negotiation, I suppose, is the best word. But I think in reality, you're always functioning in a complex adaptive system in this kind of topic. And therefore, you're constantly thinking there will be players that you haven't identified. There will be emergent behaviors as they respond to things that you've done or other people have done. And you must constantly get a sense of, okay, what's that going to look like tomorrow or in a year's time? And how do you then plan for that? And I think it's been disappointing to see that, in truth, there are so few mechanisms that are really going to hold people accountable. And in that, when people have stepped over a line, either cause punishment, whatever that might be, but cause a kind of transfer of resources back to those who've been harmed. And one of those resources, unfortunately, is going to be power. And it's a very uncomfortable situation for people who are in corporate jobs, because many people, those people have worked hard to establish themselves. And part of that has been, I'm a senior person, I have power. And what we end up looking at and reassessing is yes, but as a collective within an organization or institution, all of these powers have caused other people harm. They have removed not just their ability to voice their opinions. And we use the word agency, and it's a word that troubles a lot of people. It makes them uncomfortable. They feel defensive. But the reality is there are 700 million people that don't have enough access to energy to heat their own homes. There are tens of millions that migrate. They are nameless and unregistered and largely unknown. And we talk about them in the millions because we can't identify them as individuals, really. They're without papers, maybe without much literacy. And so they do need some sort of agency because they literally have nothing. This is important to sort of, as one sitting on one's desk, is to try and absorb what is really happening in the world. And I don't say that because I'm about to tell you, I'm not. But from each person's desk, they must think, what is the world that we're impacting? And be more open to that. Although, the day is short and people are busy.
And resources are limited. Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
One of the things I really enjoyed about the content that you had in this program that we were both part of was, I don't know why I hadn't, but I hadn't thought about the misalignment, as you referred to it, of value chains. And you mentioned it earlier, the idea that the value chain for a corporation always ends with building shareholder value. Their goal is, if you go back to the Milton Friedman days, to make money is the goal of a corporation. But the fact that the kind of value chain for people and for labor and for employees can't be based on shareholder value. It has to be on the value of human rights and fair treatment. And as you said, agency and returning some power to those who are powerless. How do you see that misalignment, which is literally in some cases directly opposed, in opposition to each other, resolving or coming to a more virtuous place? Where do you see that headed?
This is a really difficult topic. I think the problem is, as we explore it, the conclusions we reach are really very uncomfortable for our generation, and they are ugly at best. The problem is that, I don't have children, but for anyone who's listening who has children, they are going to be important to your children in a way that you not necessarily agree with. So a part of that is that if you look back and you go back to the 19th century and you think, well, okay, what was business like in the 19th century? Now, in the last couple of months, I spoke to a group of executive MBAs from Georgetown University, and then I spoke to a group of business students in Keio University in Tokyo. And one thing, before I started with them, I sort of had a little bet with them and said, I will bet you that in your studies of business, management history starts around scientific management in the 1910, 1920, basically with Henry Ford and the Model T. And that's what I learned in my MBA. Suddenly, out of nowhere, we get this business management theory of scientific management, Taylorism, and that just proceeds. Let's face it, it's 2020 now, for 100 years. But we'd be foolish to believe that it suddenly came out of nothing in the 20th century. Of course, those ideas came from other places. And so you go backwards into the 19th century, into rational management. Now, here we're getting to some very sensitive moments because we're about to cross that line into slavery. And so we have to cross that line. And we start moving into transatlantic slave trade and into industrial agriculture and the way that was managed. And if you look at the book, Accounting for Slavery, it's a very interesting analysis of the way that plantation owners used depreciation, used double entry bookkeeping to not just keep an eye on the production of cotton, but to keep an eye on the sale of human beings. And they managed their profitability on that. And so when we start to now then come back to go to these points in history, and then we start to look forward again and come back to where we are, we start to realize the very ugly kind of truth that a lot of what we learn and talk about in business about production cycles, just-in-time manufacturing, corporate compliance and governance, using key performance indicators, these are not things we have just suddenly created in our generation or in the generation before. These are some things that have evolved, that have been like everywhere else and everything else, have been passed onwards. And they have been formalized and they have been researched and they have been empirically looked at, which obviously did not happen necessarily in the 19th century. And that's important. But when we sit back, we have to recognize that the creation of the economy is obviously around efficient and effective production, which involves manual labor.
The very roots from which all of those ideas grew came out of taking advantage of people who had less power.
Exactly. And therefore the maximization, and what's the purpose of that? To maximize the investment that was put in. The difference now, I would say in 21st century, is that there are at least two generations, millennials and Gen X and Gen Alpha coming up, that actually see this in a different perspective. What we were taught in business school or, in doing business is that there are internalities and there are externalities, and we are not going to be liable for externalities. And this is the basic economic model. And what allows us as legal and compliance people is that we spend a lot of our time sifting through the debris of what is an externality and pushing the liability to somebody else, or just simply saying it's not our problem and we'll defend that position to the hilt. That is a very cultural and philosophical perspective. In the end, there is no empirical truth to what is an externality, and it's what you can defend. And as you know, as a corporate lawyer, and I think you've now got a couple of generations that say, well, no, some of the things that are externalities should be included in the corporate perspective, in what is corporate impact. And this is very uncomfortable because suddenly now there's the environment, there's worker health, there is modern slavery, there is gender violence. And so there's obviously, racism, other types of discrimination. And this makes us all very uncomfortable because generation above still in the workforce, probably in sort of advisory level, C-suite level, they're also very uncomfortable with that. When you look at the model that is probably the future, which is think about those externalities, think about the workers, think about the environment, how do we give them more agency? How do we transfer power to them? And in what magnitude and how? And then we look at the shareholder value maximization models. These are most definitely running in opposite directions.
In opposites, yeah.
And this is a struggle. And so we have intergenerational kind of battles of one set of people calling another woke and one saying, okay, boomer, and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Playing out in different ways. Another example that's a business example would be Project Maven, which was the work that Google did with the DoD, with the Pentagon here. And there was just an assumption that the employees would go along with it. We're going to work as engineers on something for the Department of Defense. And the engineers said, no, we don't want to do this kind of work. And it was disrupted quite considerably. And we start to find more examples of that. And at the moment, obviously, there's the work from home discussion versus working in an office. I'll bet there are people discussing this still hanging on to the idea that everybody should wear a tie, or that women should wear high heels. There are going to be those kind of discussions. And they are a micro element of this much larger antagonism and sort of dichotomy. And that's kind of where we are. And that's why those two models are going in opposite directions.
This conversation immediately makes me think of ESG.
Yeah.
And the kind of increase towards transparency, towards stakeholder concerns in a broader definition of stakeholder than we've seen in the past, being shareholder. The new legislation that's coming out of the EU requiring human rights due diligence. Do you think that ESG is and I know this is a platitude, but the answer, is it kind of a a force multiplier that should help to push business in the right way and bridge some of that generational gap that we're talking about? Is it when we finally get to a measure of materiality that isn't only financial that will make a difference? Where do you see as ESG's role in moving this conversation forward?
I think ESG is important and it has its place. It may only be a way station on the way to somewhere else. And I think that's probably the best way of perceiving it. And the question is, where are we going to next? The idea that it's the sort of final position, I think, is absurd. It's struggling with its own language, and it's struggling to get away from its roots, which are in quantitative performance, mostly financial performance. And I think it's also struggling around the idea, which was a goodwill idea at best, which was that companies would disclose themselves. I think there is also a natural contradiction in that anyone who's worked in business knows that due diligence, which is basically just asking questions, is what we do all day. Every business is about what did we do, how are we doing it, and it doesn't necessarily mean we get the right answers and we don't make the occasional flub. Of course that happens, but it's about asking questions and answering them. And people are doing that as we speak in pharmaceuticals, in automotive manufacturing, financial services, whatever you want to pick. The problem, I think, is that human rights people, very few of them have much corporate experience. And so they've assumed that somehow if people in corporations asked more questions, they would then become more aware of the impact that they're having. And I think as we just said, is that business people are very good at asking questions. I've never been involved in an M&A deal or any kind of new business setup where we didn't ask a million questions for months before we pulled the trigger on the deal.
Yeah.
And it's just preposterous to say that business people need to be told to do more due diligence. The truth is, between shareholder value maximization, personal incentives, high turnover of staff, the usual kind of confusion that occurs in businesses in terms of what's the strategy today versus what's the strategy in a year's time, we work best when we know what the boundaries are. And the boundaries in these areas are very, very vague. They're almost paper thin. The reality is that human beings that are a bit type A, that are ambitious, that are going to be a bit self-centric, because that's kind of how it works. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-esteem is at the top. It's not group esteem. It's not societal esteem. It's self-esteem. And we need to accept the fact that in the end is that it's got to be more than due diligence. It's got to be more than disclosure. It has to be a mixture of accountability measures, some of which may not be punitive, but some of which are. It's going to have to be, yes, disclosure. It's going to have to be greater transparency. It's going to be just a more intense mix of the things that we've got. Let's remember that that's exactly what happened to the banking industry after 9/11. A moment happened, this terrible moment occurred, and the US said, you know what, if you want to deal the US dollar, you are going to have to fall into line with a whole different range of control mechanisms, risk management tools. And the banking industry said, what are you talking about? This is going to cost billions of dollars. And there was an attempt. There were attempts by people to try and kind of just do a kind of quick fix, greenwash as it would be, although with not serious consequences. And the US government had all sorts of deferred prosecutions against huge financial institutions. But in the end, everybody kind of fell into line. And that's what is probably going to happen. The question is how much blood is spilt on the way to getting there.
In the meantime, yeah.
Because actually we're in a very difficult position, which the world that we enjoy so much as Gen X and older is not the world that our children are going to enjoy themselves. And so how much damage is going to be done before the penny eventually drops? That's the big question. How long are we going to take to learn? And what measures will we put in? And how quickly will they be put in?
To kind of bring us to our final topic for conversation today, let's say that you were one of the listeners to this podcast. You're a corporate compliance person, you're working in a corporation, and you want to make a difference in some way. You want to use your company's resources to be part of the solution, not the problem. What would be the thing that you would suggest would be the biggest bang for buck? We talked about due diligence and the idea that more questions doesn't necessarily make things better. Would it be immediately implementing a prohibition against use of unpaid labor recruiters? Would it be, making some kind of a process change to the way your company engages in procurement so that they're no longer doing just-in-time types of arrangements or arrangements where they're allowed to have all the power in the procuring organization and can dictate to the tiny supplier, hey, I need double the volume by next week, which drives kind of the need for human trafficking in many cases. Where do you see a first step? Where should somebody start?
I think the first thing you have to do is take an assessment of what you know from your desk, specifically from your desk in your office geographically, but also how much reach and control do you have about the information that's coming to you as a senior decision maker? Because if you're being fed vagaries or you're not being told the truth, maybe on purpose, maybe otherwise, unintentionally, then eventually it might be you that gets caught up in this kind of situation. Maybe it's a WRO or a petition, maybe it's something worse. And think hard about, as an individual, is that the life that you're going to lead? Are you going to be the guy or the woman who ends up being saddled with the issue of exploitation in 2022? Are you going to have to be talking about the fact that you're involved in exploiting other human beings, or involved in organized crime and wildlife trafficking or whatever it is? And I think that's the starting point, is to ask yourself those kind of questions. What is your locus of knowledge of the business that you are involved with? I think the second part then is to think, okay, who do I trust? And that could be a bigger question, but it could just simply be a question of who in my team is really going to come and tell me the truth? Who's going to really say, who's going to get on the ground, get a plane ticket, go on the ground and see what the problems actually are, and come back and tell me this is exactly what it looks like. And then be willing to embrace that situation and say, okay, we need to do something about it.
Actually embrace the reality that is facing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's your first step, because nobody, I don't think, is saying, and there's no evidence of this, that's saying, oh, well, now I know you've got to fix it like tomorrow. It's got to happen. There is going to have to be a plan. There's going to have to be a progression and a rollout of stages of change. The worst is to simply have not done the right questions. Now, one might say, well, that's just due diligence, isn't it? Due diligence ultimately, as we all know, ends up being a set of questions. Here are a set of topics you've got to do because somebody says you've got to do them. But we also know that, most corporate people, that's why I go back to that point, most people do due diligence every single day. What's more profound than simply ticking off the list that you've got in your shared drive is sitting down at a more kind of profound level and thinking, okay, what are we really looking at? Yes, the law says do this. Maybe it's multiple laws in multiple jurisdictions. If you're in a multinational corporation, it's not just the EU, it's the US, it's wherever. But you then have to think, beyond that, I am more capable of doing my own thinking. What is it that I am really wanting to think about in terms of this business? What is the situation that I would like this business to be in a year, 5 years, 10 years? How will it interact with society around it?
It becomes a values question then.
Exactly.
Right?
It becomes a values question. That's where, double materiality is important, because it does say, there is the impact and then there is the financial performance. But I would say anyone who's listening to this, you have the intelligence and probably the heart to tackle these things on your own at your desk. You may not have had the time before, and you may not have wanted to give yourself the time, but that's a starting point. The second thing is that if you're in a business, you definitely have the skills and resources. If you're in an NGO, you've got really nothing. There's no funding unless you've really got to do a whole grant making process. It is a nightmare. But in a business, you've got all sorts of skills, all sorts of resources available, and therefore you've got to use those. When I was in the finance industry and my career was very much exposed to that change from in post 9/11 period, and then of course the financial crash. And it was just not acceptable to not know where the money that you managed was either coming from or going to. You simply couldn't say, I don't know, because you knew ultimately that the financial intelligence unit or the local regulator would not accept a don't know. You had to have the systems in place. And this is where the due diligence legislation falls away, because it doesn't really address proper systemic change inside businesses. What infrastructure should you use? What should you apply? That's where you're going to have to do the thinking yourself. But in a corporation, you've got lots of resources. You've got the ability to seek consultants, and that's something you should want to do.
And the ability, hopefully, to drive the corporation's culture in general towards one that is more personally accountable, and where those values matter, and where the business is operated in accordance with and not in opposition with their stated values. Because when they're saying one thing and doing another, greenwashing or, virtuous signaling. That's where the gaps, appear. And that is really where your fodder is as Liberty Shared, right? To go in
That's right.
and find those differences.
That's exactly it. I would just finish by saying, when I did a lot of white collar crime sort of investigations, it was internal investigation. When we identified people who had done various things that had caused harm to clients' money, we were an asset management company. When you interviewed them, they would always generally start with the same thing, which was everybody else is doing it. And I would say that must be a very familiar refrain to anyone who's listening, who's in compliance, who's in risk management investigation. And I would say to those people in compliance risk management is don't be like them. Don't just do what everybody else is doing at this juncture in society.
History. Yeah.
History. Yeah. Do something different. Do something more. And compliance is sometimes seen and is often talked about as boring and gray, but what you can do is make it more individual, make it more innovative. And that is about the parameters of your business and how it behaves in the world. And you do have control of that in compliance and in legal and in risk management. And so do that. That's what I would advise.
Thank you so much. Let's wrap up. It's been a fascinating conversation. How can people get in touch with you or find out more about Liberty Shared and your mission?
Sure, you can visit our website and there's a contact address there and that comes to me. And I'd be very happy to speak to anybody who'd like to talk more.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Duncan. It's been great.
Thank you, Gwen. Thanks very much.